At that time, Marilyn Rose Monroe was 68 years old and lived a routine marked by the quiet discipline of someone who had learned to live with just enough. Widowed for more than a decade, she had worked in small businesses in Santa Clarita and cleaned houses for years so that her children would lack nothing. Now she lived alone in a ground-floor apartment with a window that let in the California sunlight through already frayed cream-colored curtains. Above the refrigerator hung two handwritten lists, one with the month's bills and another with what she could put off or outright sacrifice. On the nightstand rested an old metal box with a sticky tape label that read, "Hawaii, our little piece of paradise." There she kept loose change, folded bills, and receipts that showed every sacrifice made in the name of a dream. At first glance, she looked like an ordinary grandmother, wearing worn white sneakers and a blue polka-dotted scarf inherited from her late James. But inside, she was driven by a fierce determination to reunite the entire family on a trip that would be both a tribute and an act of love. That dream had begun 3 years earlier when she turned on her old computer, which sounded like a tired engine, and created a spreadsheet to plan down to the smallest detail. She booked an oceanfront villa in Kihei, selected excursions for the grandchildren to see sea turtles in Malawaka, and marked with green ink the places where she imagined James would smile if he were present. She ordered sand-colored t-shirts with the phrase "Family is Forever 2023", and prepared tool bags with shells she had collected on past trips with personalized labels for each grandchild. In a hardcover notebook, she pasted receipts and noted key dates, confirm flights, book transportation, remember sunscreen. She had also planned a simple but powerful ritual: light a lavender candle every Friday night on the beach and tell a story about James so her grandchildren would get to know him beyond the photos. All this effort wasn't just tourism. It was her way of stitching together the generations of her family with invisible thread, of ensuring that a shared memory remained that would survive even oblivion. 2 days before everything was set to happen, when the suitcase was already open on the bed and the folded t-shirts were waiting to be delivered, Marilyn received a message on her cell phone that chilled her blood. It came from Nathan, her eldest son, and said bluntly, "You're not going. My wife prefers it to be just her family. You've done your part by paying." The text was short, terse, devoid of emotion, and left Marilyn sitting on the edge of the bed feeling as if the air had become too thick to breathe. In an instant, everything she had imagined, the grandchildren's laughter in the sand, the candle lit in honor of James, the family photo wearing matching t-shirts, collapsed like a house of cards blown away by a cruel wind. It wasn't just a cancellation. It was confirmation that for them she had become an ATM, the useful shadow they needed, until it was no longer convenient. Marilyn checked the travel agency's confirmation emails again and again, and there she discovered something even more painful. All the reservations were in the name of Tanya, her daughter-in-law, and her relatives. Her own name didn't appear anywhere. Not on the plane tickets, not on the rooms, not even on the family excursions she'd paid for herself. She felt her hands go cold, and she clutched the blue polka-dotted scarf like a lifeline. It was the memory of James that kept her from completely collapsing. The humiliation was profound, because it wasn't just a matter of forgetting, but of deliberate exclusion. And in that moment, as the afternoon sun cast an orange glow over her bedroom wall, she realized the day had come when she had to stop begging for affection and start defending her dignity. Marilyn spent that night almost sleepless, with the whirring of the ceiling fan marking a monotonous rhythm above her head. Each turn in bed was a reminder of the betrayal, but also an attempt to find clarity amid the chaos. At dawn, she made a strong cup of coffee and, holding the cup, opened the bank app on her phone. Everything was there: the special fund, the account with only her name as the account holder. That vision was like a spark in the darkness. She suddenly understood that she still held the key to everything they were trying to take from her. She didn't need to scream or confront words that would fall on deaf ears. She could respond with the same coldness with which she'd been pushed aside, but without losing her own dignity. She waited for the exact moment. She knew the flight would leave that same afternoon and that, as soon as they arrived at the airport, they would start using the cards linked to her account. With calculated calm, she accessed her online banking and activated the total block. It was a simple click, but that gesture condensed years of accumulated silences, invisible sacrifices, and frustrated waits. She imagined Nathan's face when the card was declined, the discomfort at the check-in counters, the awkward murmurings between Tanya and her family. It wasn't revenge, it was justice, confirmation that she wasn't a disposable piece on the chessboard of her own life. She closed her phone, took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, felt she was regaining control of her story. At the Los Angeles airport, while Marilyn remained in the calm of her home, the scene turned into a whirlwind of awkwardness for the others. Nathan, his expression stiff, handed the first card to the counter, and the airline employee returned it with an awkward smile. "Sorry, it's declined." They tried another and then another until nervous glances began to exchange. Tanya, her face flushed, raised her voice and asked to speak to a supervisor, convinced it must be a system error. But there was no mistake. The account was blocked. The children, oblivious to the adult drama, asked why they couldn't board the plane, and the atmosphere was filled with whispers of reproach and public shaming. Meanwhile, Marilyn sat in her living room with her blue scarf draped over her knees, watching the morning light illuminate the dust in the air like golden particles. She had prepared chamomile tea, and each sip was a reminder that the decision had been hers, and no one else could take it away from her. She didn't need to see their faces to know how they reacted. She could imagine them checking their phones, sending her messages full of demands and belated promises. And, indeed, the messages arrived, first pleas disguised as apologies, then harsher demands, and finally veiled threats to fix things if she unlocked the account. Marilyn read them with a calm that surprised even herself. She was no longer looking for an explanation or an apology, because the wound had revealed something greater: the power of saying enough. Marilyn let a few hours pass before opening her bank app again. Her balance was intact, the refund on her reservations already in process, and in that instant, she realized the money could have meaning again if she used it differently. She spent the afternoon flipping through her hardcover notebook, crossing out names from trips and jotting down new ones. Not those of her biological family, but of women with whom she'd shared silences at the community center and at church. Widows spending the holidays alone, exhausted caregivers who'd never allowed themselves a break, grandmothers invisible to their own grandchildren. She thought of them not as replacements, but as companions on a journey that deserved to exist. That same night, she picked up her phone and began making calls, one by one, her voice shaky but steady. The answers surprised her. There were tears on the other end of the line, disbelief, and a repeated, "Are you serious?" One of the women confessed. She'd never seen the ocean. Another said she hadn't been on a plane in 20 years. And a third laughed through her sobs because she didn't own a swimsuit and couldn't remember what it was like to buy one. In those voices, Marilyn felt what she'd been searching for so long: sincere gratitude, shared excitement, a desire to experience something together. When she hung up the last call, she closed her eyes and imagined herself on the beach, surrounded by women who understood what it meant to give their all without expecting anything in return. And for the first time since she'd received that cruel message from Nathan, she smiled with peace in her heart. When they finally landed in Hawaii, Marilyn felt like her feet were touching sacred ground, not because of the island itself, but because of what that moment meant. The warm air, infused with salt and hibiscus flowers, hit her face like a personal welcome. The women accompanying her walked with wide eyes, like children discovering a new world. Some stopped to photograph the palm trees, others giggled nervously at the local accent, and one bent down to touch the sand as if she wanted to make sure it was real. Marilyn watched them silently, holding her blue scarf as a symbol of James, feeling that somehow he, too, was present with every laugh and every sigh of wonder. The first night, They organized a circle on the beach in front of the rented villa. Marilyn lit the lavender candle she had brought from California and explained the small ritual she had originally planned for her family, to tell a story about James while the flame remained alive. What she didn't expect was that, one by one, the others also began to share memories. A husband who died silently after a long illness, a son lost in an accident, years of loneliness disguised as strength. Each word fell like a stone in water, generating ripples that reached everyone equally. In the end, there was no isolated crying. There was a shared cry, accompanied by hugs that needed no explanation. In that unexpected communion, Marilyn understood that she had transformed her grief into a refuge for others. The following nights became a patient weaving of shared voices and silences. By day, the group learned to snorkel among fish that looked like living paintbrushes. At dusk, they forged flower crowns as the sky turned from coral to violet. And upon returning to the village, they cooked together simple recipes that tasted like home. Banana bread, sticky rice with mango, ginger tea served in mismatched cups. Marilyn, who once made lists so she wouldn't forget anything, now let the hours pass without a clock, as if the island had disarmed the internal mechanism that kept her alert. One Wednesday, as they stored shells in jars labeled with each one's name, someone said quietly, "I didn't know joy could return in pieces." It was then that Marilyn realized that the ceremony she designed for her family had become, unplanned, a school for returning to themselves. That same night, in front of the calm flame of the lavender candle, Marilyn spoke not only to the women gathered, but to anyone who needed to hear from the other side of the screen, that sometimes dignity is ignited with a small gesture and everything changes color. If you've made it this far, tell me where you're following me from, and if you ever experienced a moment when your enough gave you back your breath. Reading it may silently help someone else. And if you think this story can sustain someone you love, share it. Not for me, but for those who today still don't dare to light their own candle. With that gentle request, Marilyn closed her eyes and let the sea continue to speak its own truth, like an ancient metronome marking the beat of what is reborn. The days on the island passed with a serenity that contrasted with the increasingly tense messages Marilyn received on her cell phone. Nathan went from pleas disguised as regret to outright demands. "Unblock the account, Mom. You can't do this to us." Tanya even texted him that he was embarrassing her in front of her family. Marilyn read those words while drinking coffee on the terrace facing the sea. And instead of rage, she felt a serene emptiness, as if each sentence confirmed that she had made the right decision. The sound of the waves was her best filter against the noise of ingratitude. She didn't respond, because she had realized that silence was now her most powerful language. Afternoon. After returning from an excursion where they saw whales breaching in the distance, Marilyn gathered the group on the sand and suggested they write letters they would never send. Each woman bent over a blank sheet of paper and poured out into words everything she had held back for years. Reproaches to absent children, confessions of weariness, memories of lost loves. Afterward, they built a small fire, and one by one, let the flames consume the papers. Marilyn watched the breeze carry the ashes toward the ocean and felt her own weight dissolve with them. It was as if life was finally giving her back the chance to be seen not as a silent provider, but as a woman who still had much to live for. The night of the climax arrived without warning, at an impromptu dinner party under paper lanterns hanging from the branches of a palm tree. They had prepared fresh fish with pineapple and sticky rice, and while they ate, they took turns saying out loud one thing they had regained on the trip: confidence, laughter, calm, a desire to sing. When it was Marilyn's turn, she held up the blue polka-dotted handkerchief and said clearly, "I've regained my name, my place. I'm no longer just Mom or Grandma, I am Marilyn." The others applauded and some cried because they understood the weight of that declaration. For the first time in years, she felt whole, as if the pieces she had been losing had been reassembled on the shores of the Pacific. At the same time, messages from Nathan, kept coming in on her cell phone, some pleading, others angry, but they remained unopened. Marilyn let it vibrate on the nightstand and preferred to listen to the waves. She realized she didn't need any more explanations or apologies, because her family had chosen to exclude her even before the money. James's true legacy wasn't in bank accounts or paid trips, but in the ability to rise with dignity after each blow. Looking up at the starry Hawaiian sky, Marilyn felt a cycle coming to a close. She had transformed pain into power and loneliness into a real community. That certainty became her greatest inheritance. Their final days in Hawaii were a succession of small celebrations. One morning, they all learned to dance hula together at a local workshop. They laughed awkwardly as they tried to imitate the instructor's fluid movements, but there was a lightness in that laughter none of them remembered feeling in years. Another afternoon, they sat and painted shells in bright colors and then hung them on a string outside the village, as if each one were a personal banner waving in the sea breeze. Marilyn watched these simple gestures and became convinced that the trip hadn't been a replacement for what was lost, but the creation of something new, something that hadn't existed before. A chosen family, united not by blood, but by respect and recognition. On the last night before packing their bags, they met again on the beach. They lit the lavender candle for the last time and, shared aloud what they were taking with them. Some spoke of peace, others of renewed strength, and one said she had regained her ability to dream. When Marilyn's turn came, her eyes shone with a sweet weariness. I take with me the certainty that I am not alone, and that kindness is not an obligation, but a gift. Then they let the candle burn slowly, a symbol of both closure and continuity. The silent sea bore witness to that invisible pact between women who had learned to support one another. Back in California, the contrast was stark. Moving from the golden beaches to her modest apartment with its peeling walls confronted her with the same loneliness as always, but now that loneliness took on a different tone. It was no longer a painful emptiness, but a space she could fill with new choices. On the table, she left a jar of sand and shells she had brought from Hawaii, and every time she looked at it, she remembered the laughter they'd shared under the lanterns. Her cell phone, on the other hand, continued to vibrate insistently. Messages from Nathan demanding explanations, missed calls at all hours, even audio recordings in which he mixed reproaches with vague promises of reconciliation. Marilyn listened to them only once, and then deactivated the notifications. She understood that for the first time, she had the right to choose which voices deserved to enter her home. With the trip reimbursement still available in her account, she made an unexpected decision. Instead of saving it for emergencies or letting it lie in the bank, she contacted the women she had traveled with and proposed something new: a community fund to organize quarterly get-togethers. They didn't have to be on distant islands or with impossible luxuries. They could be hikes in parks, weekend retreats in simple cabins, lunches where everyone brought a dish. The idea was to keep the flame of the shared experience alive. Upon hearing her, everyone immediately agreed, and what began as a one-time trip transformed into a support network. Marilyn was thrilled to realize she had sown something lasting. She no longer expected recognition from those who had used her. Now she relied on a circle of women who had chosen to be present. A week after her return, Nathan appeared unannounced at her apartment door. He was wearing a wrinkled shirt and had deep, dark circles under his eyes, as if the weight of frustration had disfigured him in just a few days. Marilyn watched him through the peephole, before opening it. Inside, a mixture of pain and calm sustained her. When she finally unlocked the lock, he entered without asking permission, his tone somewhere between pleading and accusatory. "Mom, you can't do this to us. We're your family." But those words, which would have previously made her tremble, now seemed hollow, lacking the force of truth. She listened to him without interrupting, sitting in her favorite armchair, stroking the blue handkerchief as if James were there to support her. Nathan tried one argument after another. He talked about the children, about Tanya, about the embarrassment he'd suffered at the airport. even about the debts he now had to deal with. But each sentence revealed the same root. No genuine remorse, only anger at having lost control over the money. Marilyn took a deep breath and, with a serenity that surprised even herself, said simply, "Family is not measured by what I pay, but by how they treat me when they think they don't need me." Nathan remained silent, unable to respond. After a few tense minutes, he abruptly stood up and left, leaving behind an echo of hurried footsteps in the hallway. Marilyn closed the door and leaned her forehead against the wood. This time she didn't cry. What she felt was a profound relief, as if she had healed a wound that had been open for too many years. As the months passed, the women's network became a kind of traveling refuge. They met in borrowed homes, community centers, and even the local library, where they brought thermoses of coffee and homemade cakes. Each meeting had a theme: resilience, gratitude, forgiveness, unfulfilled dreams. Marilyn, who had always been the one to make sure everyone had what they needed, now allowed herself the luxury of talking about herself as well. She discovered that sharing her story out loud not only freed her, but also gave strength to others. Several widows confessed that, thanks to her, they had made decisions they had been putting off for years: selling a house that was too big, enrolling in painting classes, traveling alone for the first time. This was more than a support group. It was a silent revolution. At one of those gatherings, one of the women brought a lavender candle and placed it in the center of the table. "For James," she said, and everyone nodded respectfully. Marilyn felt a lump in her throat, but also a warmth she had never experienced, even with her own family. The memory of her husband had become a collective symbol of strength and continuity. Each time the candle was lit, it was not just for him, but for all those who were absent, and for all the stories that had been ignored for too long. That shared flame transformed into a new ritual, a promise that they would never again relegate themselves to the background. And in that simple gesture, Marilyn understood that she had found something far more powerful than Nathan's approval. She had found a place where her voice truly resonated. Encouraged by the energy generated by this small group, Marilyn began to think bigger. She contacted her neighborhood's community center and proposed organizing a series of open talks for older women who felt invisible in their own families. At first, she thought no one would attend, but the room filled with more than 30 people at the first meeting. Some had arrived by bus from distant neighborhoods. Others had heard about it from a simple flyer at the bakery. Marilyn, with her blue scarf tied around her neck, told the story of the thwarted trip and how she had transformed betrayal into a new beginning. She didn't tell it with dramatic effect, but with the calm of someone who had survived the storm. And every time she mentioned the lavender candle, she saw the listeners' eyes moisten in silence. From that day on, the group ceased to be an intimate circle and became a local movement. They began organizing charitable activities, preparing meals for the homeless, accompanying seniors in nursing homes, even organizing short bus trips for those who had never left California. The local press found out and dedicated a feature story to the group entitled, "The Grandmother Who Turned Exclusion into Community." Marilyn appeared in the main photo, smiling shyly, surrounded by women of all ages. Seeing herself in print, she felt a mixture of pride and modesty. She had never sought fame, only a place where her kindness wouldn't be confused with obligation. But she understood that her testimony could inspire others, even beyond her immediate circle. One Sunday morning, Marilyn was surprised as she left church. A group of neighbors was waiting for her with flowers and a makeshift banner that read, "Thank you for reminding us that family is chosen." These were people she didn't even know well, but who had read about her in the newspaper or heard her story by word of mouth. They thanked her not only for creating a space of support, but for showing with her actions that even the deepest wounds could turn into something fruitful. Moved, Marilyn held the flowers to her chest and thought of James. Silently, she whispered to him that all of this was also his doing, because he had planted in her a strength that now multiplied in others. That day she realized that her pain had not been in vain. The community center soon became too small. They had to move to a larger room provided by the public library, where each meeting brought together dozens of women with similar stories. Some spoke of children who had forgotten them, others of marriages that had reduced them to a shadow. Marilyn listened respectfully, jotted down the ideas that emerged in a notebook, and always closed the meetings by reminding them of the importance of not allowing themselves to be sucked into invisibility. One night, as they lit the lavender candle, a new woman in the group said, "This saved me from giving up." Marilyn felt a shiver run down her spine, because in those words she recognized her own reflection, months before. And it was then that she knew that James's true legacy was not just familial, but collective. A fire passed from hand to hand. Over the course of a year, what began as a frustrated journey had become a life-changing movement. Marilyn no longer saw herself as the woman used and discarded by her own family, but as the driving force of a community that breathed dignity. She had learned to set boundaries, to say no when she had previously remained silent, and to give only from love, and not from obligation. The circle of women grew to reach new heights, invitations to speak, virtual meetings, and even a homemade documentary made by young students who wanted to portray her story. Marilyn, with her modesty intact, always said the same thing. "I didn't do anything extraordinary, I just lit a candle in the darkness and others decided to keep it alive." And if you're reading this far, perhaps you also have a candle waiting to be lit. Tell me in the comments where you're joining me, or share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their worth. We often believe our voice doesn't matter, but when combined with that of others, it can change the course of a life. Give it a like if you feel these words touched you, because perhaps your simple gesture is the spark someone needs. Just as Marilyn transformed a betrayal into community, you too can be part of that invisible circle that supports those who no longer want to feel alone. At the last gathering of the year, Marilyn showed up with a small wooden box. Inside, she kept the lavender candle, already burned out by so many nights of ritual. She placed it in the center of the table and said with a serene smile, "This flame is not mine. It belongs to everyone." They lit it together, and around that flickering light shared hugs and promises to keep going. Marilyn, as she looked at the illuminated faces, realized she no longer needed Nathan's or Tanya's approval, because she had found a family that recognized her for who she was, not for what she could afford. The pain still existed, but it no longer defined her. It had become a seed that blossomed into solidarity. Returning home that night, she placed the blue scarf on the nightstand and looked out the window at the starry sky. She lit a solitary candle one last time, this time just for James, and spoke to him silently. "Your legacy lives on, not just in me, but in all of them." She blew out the flame with a gentle breath, and in the dimness, she felt a peace she had never experienced before. She closed her eyes, certain that she had transformed betrayal into power and loneliness into communion. She was no longer the invisible grandmother who expected gratitude from those who didn't value her. She was Marilyn, a free, dignified woman surrounded by respect. And in that certainty, she found her true home.